Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of I Came for Science, a show about sex and reproduction and inclusion in STEM. I'm your host, Laura Surratt. I'm a professor of biology, and I've been studying animal sex for the past 30 years. Please join me as we normalize talking about sex and what we know about it, as well as the journeys of the scientists who study it. Today, I get to speak with Patty Brennan, who's an evolutionary biologist in the Department of Biological Sciences at Mount Holyoke College. We'll be speaking about her research on the science of sex and reproduction and about her science advocacy. Welcome, Patty.
Thanks, Laura. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh my gosh, I am so excited to have you here. It's such an honor. You are like the quintessential person for this podcast. You do amazing work in the science of sex and reproduction. You stand up for science and you work in inclusion in STEM. It's like all of the things this podcast is about wrapped up in one person. Thank you again. I really wanted to interview you because you were one of the first scientists to bring widespread attention to the importance of studying and understanding the structure and evolution of female reproductive organs. Can you start by telling us about your research area and some of the surprising findings from your research so far?
Yeah, so in my lab, we study the evolutionary morphology of genitalia, which, sounds like very oddly specific, but actually is quite broad because we look at the genitalia of females and males across a whole bunch of different species of animals that have bones. So I typically don't study insects, but I like, animals with bones. And it's an area of research that I didn't really plan to get into. I just sort of stumbled upon it when I was doing my graduate work. When I was at Cornell University, I was studying birds that are these ground birds. They look like little footballs with legs. They're called tinamous. And they're super cool. I was interested in them because they have exclusive male parental care. So the male takes care of the babies and incubates the eggs. And as I was, following these birds all over the forest, I saw them mating one time. And then I realized, to my great surprise, that they had a penis. And up until that moment, I had never come across the idea that birds have penises.
Okay, wait, can we pause there for a second? What did you see exactly that made you realize they had a penis?
Yeah, so what I saw, like when birds mate, if you look at your, whichever birds you might have in your backyard, when they mate, they do something called a cloacal kiss, which is like a real, very quick, touch of the cloaca. And in that very brief encounter, the male transfers actually billions of sperm into the female.
Wow.
But they don't actually have an intromittent organ. They don't have a penis that they put inside of the female. But what I saw when these tinamous mated, when they separated, their mating lasted much longer than a cloacal kiss. And then when they separated, I saw this thing hanging off his cloaca. It was basically like a weird looking corkscrew shaped white thing that looked really bizarre. I had never seen anything like it. And I actually, in fact, thought it was a parasite because he was so weird looking. But then the male started sort of pulling him into his cloaca, and then I realized, oh my gosh, maybe that's a penis, right? And so he started putting it back in his cloaca, and so I made myself a mental note to look into bird genitalia when I came back from the field, and that's exactly what I did. And so I actually wrote a postdoctoral proposal because I realized that nobody was looking at this question of weird bird genitalia and why most species don't have it, right? Which seems like evolutionarily such a bizarre question. And so it was, I wrote a proposal really focused actually on male genitalia. I wasn't at the time particularly thinking about females. I just thought, isn't it odd that birds have lost their penis? How do you even lose a penis? Seems very strange. And so when I started my project, tinamous are very hard to study because they're only in the neotropics, so they're not easy to access. But ducks, it turns out they also are in that category of birds that have penises. And they're everywhere. We eat them, we breed them, we keep them as pets. And so they seem like the perfect group for me to look at these weird genitalia. When I dissected my first duck penis, it was very similar in some ways to what I had seen in the tinamou, this white corkscrew, weird looking organ, very, very large. And then immediately the next question that popped into my brain was, oh my gosh, so then what is the vagina like in these female dogs, right? What does it look like? Because I couldn't imagine that it wouldn't be adapted in somewhere, that it wouldn't have a weird shape or something. I wasn't entirely sure how, but I figure, oh, females are probably very weird. And I had been dissecting a bunch of bird vaginas up until then, and they all were nice little tubes, folded. But when I dissected the female duck, I almost fell off my chair because
Wow.
it was basically like I was unwrapping all this connective tissue out of the outside of the vagina. And it was the most convoluted structure I had ever seen. It just had all these pockets and folds, and it just looked like a labyrinth. And so to me, that was an incredible moment, because you can imagine that you don't expect that you're going to make a big morphological discovery.
Right. You
Like
think
in
like
this
there's all
day
these
and
museum
age.
specimens,
That's
right?
right.
All
I
these
mean, and
things.
people,
Yeah.
especially birds and things that we
Yeah.
eat. I mean, and we breed ducks, right? Like lots
Right.
of people do artificial insemination in ducks. And so
Oh,
I
right.
never in a
Yeah.
million years, yeah, I mean, I never thought I was going to find something unique or special. I was just curious. I was sure that there was something there and that somebody probably had already seen it. And it turns out there was nothing in the literature about avian vaginas in the context of interacting with a penis. And so it was a perfect opportunity for me to start carving out a little bit of a niche for me to
Mm-hmm.
look at what was going on with these females. And it was just fascinating, right? I think I mentioned fascinating from the point of view of, wow, I can't believe nobody has described this. And then, the fact that I get to do it because of who I am, right?
Yeah.
And how I am as a person in the world, and how that influences the kinds of questions that I find interesting.
Yeah. What was it about your lived experiences or who you are that led you into this research?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably primarily two things. One is that I am a person with a vagina. And, when you see a big, giant, weird penis, it sort of certainly made me wonder, oh my gosh, so,
Where's that going to
what's
go?
happening with the vagina?
Exactly.
Where is it going to
Yes.
go? Right. I think in one of my interviews, I basically said, you need a garage to park the car, right? So you do, like, you need to have some structure where that weird tentacle looking thing is going to go. So where is that? And so that's certainly from that point of view. I'm a woman. I identify as a woman, and so that seemed like a natural question. And then the other thing is also culturally, right? I'm Latina. I grew up in Colombia, and I studied biology in Colombia. And culturally, there's not as much sexual taboo in Colombia, and certainly in many South American countries compared to other places in the world, right? So it's not like it's the most progressive place either, but certainly comparatively speaking, it's okay to talk about sex. It's not a big taboo. And so I was comfortable, looking at genitalia and thinking about genitalia and sperm and vaginas. And that was okay. I wasn't uncomfortable with that line of
Right.
study.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What was known about this area of research before you started, and why do you think that others might not have been asking the same questions that you did?
Yeah, I mean, not very much. So, like the general morphology of the penis had been described by early anatomists, just as you would imagine. German anatomists had done a really wonderful job of describing the duck penis, but that was pretty much it for a very long
Mhm.
time. And in fact, it's interesting because we even found some books where there are descriptions of bird morphology where they are so careful describing every single organ system and then bypass the penis entirely. Like there's no way that they didn't see it. They certainly saw it. They just didn't want to deal with it. Again, because of these sexual taboos. And it's fascinating to see that. And actually, this is something that persists, by the way. I'm sort of specifically thinking about some anatomy books in the 1800s, but even now,
Mhm.
there are lots of morphology and anatomy books that just do not talk about genitalia at all. And
Right.
it's
So
interesting.
weird. Yeah.
But I think that the other things that we knew more recently were, for example, that in the male dogs, there seemed to be an association between the size of their penis and a behavior that they show that's called forced copulation. And is basically what they were able to show is that species where there were more of these forced copulations seem to have a longer and a more elaborate penis. But of course, this research was done in a time when we didn't have a way to correct correct for phylogeny or anything else. It was just basically like, here are some interesting correlations that we can see, but we don't know anything else. And so, we also knew, and there was a cover in Nature magazine in 2003 where they showed the dog with the longest penis. And he had a 43 centimeter long penis, which is pretty remarkable. It was longer than the male himself, right? And I have talked to the folks. In fact, I have collaborated with the folks who wrote that paper subsequently. And they're amazing scientists, right? And I've asked them this question. I'm like, you were there, like you're collecting ducks in this pond. You pull out this male and you're like, whoa, look at these giant penis. And then there's like all these females right there. Why didn't you just like shoot a female? And then you could have had the longest vagina, like, whatever. And then the answer was exactly what you would predict, which is it just didn't occur to us, right? And that is fine. That is not a reflection of the quality of science or scientists that these folks were doing. They're amazing scientists in their own right. But not one person can have all the questions or all the answers. And so that's why we need multiple people who can ask questions from their own perspectives, because then we get closer to the truth, right? If we don't do that, which is what we did for many decades, where only white males were allowed in the room, then we get some portion of the truth, but we're not going to get all of it. So we really need diversity of viewpoints, because everybody has a different way of seeing things. And even you and I, we could sit with the exact same data and we're going to walk away with slightly different conclusions and slightly different ways of explaining what we have seen, because we're all individuals. That's why it's important to make room, because we end up with richer answers, better answers.
And can you tell us about some of the other surprising findings that came out of your research in this area?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot. So, so with the ducks, I'm going to tell you, we did one experiment that was crazy, because it was, can we change the morphology of the penis by changing the social system of the ducks?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, because, the penis grows and shrinks every year, just like testes, right? And so it grows.
No, I didn't actually know that. I feel.
Yeah.
Wait, is that true in all species or?
In all species? Yeah. Well,
Oh my gosh.
not really anymore in the domesticated ones, because they have been kept at the same light conditions for so long that they don't change anymore. But the wild ducks
and like
no.
Okay. This is
no.
a duck
This is
thing.
very specific to birds,
okay,
and particularly actually to ducks, because ducks are so seasonal in their breeding, and so their testes grow every year and then they shrink when they're done
that makes
breeding.
Sense. Yeah.
And with that surge of testosterone, then the penis grows, and then when that is over, the penis just sort of, the surface of it sloughs off, and then it regrows again the next year.
What?
I know, it's insane. And the other thing that happens is that because of that, the penis just gets longer as the males get older. And I will often joke that if I figured the formula for that, I would be a billionaire faster than anything else. That's where my money is going to be.
That's right.
Oh yeah, much
get
better
rich
than
quick
Viagra.
So
we did this crazy experiment just to see what would happen if we put the males under different social treatments. And so we put some males alone with a female and other males in social groups. And we found that the males in the social groups, where they had to compete against other males for access to females, they did one of two things. One thing was, in one species, the males in the social groups grew longer penises, right? And so they had longer penises on average, and the penis stayed long for longer in the season.
Wow.
Because of the plasticity of those elevated levels of testosterone, right? And so it's nuts. But then in the other species, what we found was that one male will become the dominant male and beat everybody else up and didn't let them grow a penis.
Oh my gosh.
And so
it's like the reproductive suppression in bees too. Yeah.
Exactly. And we didn't know the ducks could do that, right? But in my mind, what that says to me, and sort of like the lesson that I walk away with, is that even these traits that so often we see as fixed, genital traits, they're fixed, they're binary, they're this way, they're actually really plastic, right? And we have to take that plasticity into account. Social environment matters just as much as your abiotic environment matters. And so that was definitely surprising and very cool. And I could have stayed working with birds forever because they're so cool. And there's so much that we don't know about them. But I started to wonder, how much of this was about ducks being unique and cool and interesting, and how much was it it related to the fact that nobody else seemed to be looking at this genitalia. And so for my own career, I thought, well, should I keep diving deeper into all the little particular details of birds and their genitals, or should I expand to other groups? And so I went that route, and I said, okay, because it cannot be that ducks are that unique and that I just, quite lucky to stumble on like this incredible system. And so I think it was a very smart decision, because ever since I have been looking at all these different groups and finding examples of these incredible adaptations in the genitalia of vertebrates for multiple reasons, right? So in the ducks, the story turned out to be that these very convoluted vaginas in the females were the result of sexual conflict, because these males were using their penis as a weapon in forced copulation. And so because the males had these big, long penises in a species with more forced copulation, they could use those penises to force females to copulate. And the females co-evolved these convoluted vaginas. But we also had duck species where there was no forced copulation. The penises were very short, very small, and the females had perfectly straight, normal-looking vaginas. So we knew that this was a co-evolutionary dynamic. These were things that were changing together. And they were changing because, from the point of view of a female, sexual autonomy matters. The female wants to have the say on who's going to sire her offspring. And the female has already picked a mate. You know, ducks form pair bonds, at least seasonally, in most species. So the female has already made a choice. And then she has these males that are flying from who knows where, trying to force copulate with her and trying to get some paternity. So, of course, she's not going to like that. And she's using these vaginal adaptations as a way to reassert her choice. And there's genetic data that backs this up, right? So these forced copulations are generally not very successful, despite the fact that they're very common. And so the crazy thing is that, you know, this sounds like such a crazy story, right? Sex and violence,
a really unique
and weird
system.
Very unique system. And then we went in and we found almost the exact same thing in dolphins.
Wow.
Right? And for the exact same reason, right? So we find that in dolphins, females have incredibly convoluted vaginas that seem to allow the female, at least from the analysis that we could do with these 3D models and understanding the functional shape of the genitalia, that there is only a single angle in which the dolphin penis can actually enter fully into the female. You know, so it's kind of like this convergent evolution of convoluted genitalia as a response to similar male strategies, right? Either forced copulation in the ducks or sexual harassment in the dolphin. Now, of course, it's hard to know, you know, like we have no way of looking inside of a dolphin when they're having sex, and we don't have a way to look inside of a duck when they're having sex, because for both of these groups, sex is actually super quick. Like some people look at what happens during sex in insects because you can drop them in liquid nitrogen and you can see
flash freeze,
right, where the male genitalia end up and stuff like that. We can do that with vertebrates, right? And we definitely can do it with species that have sex very quickly.
Right.
That to me was a huge surprise. Like, you know, finding these similar convoluted genital adaptations in two groups that are so totally different, right? Evolutionarily is really crazy. And I think, you know, in dolphins there are other parts of that story that also come into play.
That's so interesting. Your research has inspired me and so many other people. I'm curious, what are you currently working on, and where's your research going next?
We've continued to look at sort of these genital dynamics, right? Like what happens when animals get down to the business of having sex. Really, you know, like the very physical act of mating. And it turns out that actually biologists have not been collecting those data, again, because there is a very sort of prudish attitude towards sex and sexual behavior. And so frustratingly enough, we find a lot of papers where people are describing in excruciating detail all the courtship behavior, and then it wiggled this way and they wiggled that way, and then they made it, and then they'll stop. And then they'll be like, and then after mating, blah, 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 blah. And then they sort of pick it up again. But it's like when it gets to the act of mating, a lot of people just stop data collection in that moment, which is very frustrating when you're trying to understand how sex actually works, like the mechanics of sex.
That's true. Even in the mosquitoes that I study, Aedes aegypti, which are really, really well studied because they transmit all sorts of pathogens. And it was just recently, just this month, that a paper came out about like the really intricate couplings that go on between males and females, and how you can see ejected sperm on the male genitalia as he's like coming out. But I don't know how fast the ducks and the dolphins do it, but the mosquitoes, it's like 6 seconds and it's done.
Yeah, 6 seconds is long. I mean, for the ducks, it's a third of a second.
Whoa.
We had to use high-speed video cameras because otherwise we would miss it. Yeah, it's pretty quick.
Yeah.
And the dolphins is, you know, it's a couple couple seconds. And so because we look at genitalia and there is this very close mechanical interaction between the male and the female, then we expect that those adaptations will be pretty obvious in some morphological way. And they often are, which is cool because then, we don't have to, it's not a hard sell in any way. It's like, here are the data, females increase the thickness of their vaginal walls if the males have spines in their penises. Or females increase the density of the collagen in their vagina if males have spines. It makes sense because they're adapting, they're responding to potential harm by protecting themselves.
Such an interesting coevolutionary story. And I love that you've expanded out to snakes and alpaca and bats, all sorts of things. Yeah, it's very cool. I was wondering if we could turn and talk a bit to people's response to you as a scientist, both in terms of other scientists, but also the general public and other folks. So I wanted to start first by asking, did you have experiences where people either encouraged your journey in STEM or discouraged your journey in STEM?
Yeah, of course. And, I'm sure that this happens to everybody, right? But I was a Colombian woman in the 80s, a teenager in the 80s. I was not supposed to be particularly good in STEM. I had people straight up telling me that, I was getting good grades in a class or I was getting a research opportunity because of the way I look and not because of who I was and what I could do. And I took that and just turned it into the fire in my belly to prove them wrong, right? Which I think that in this day and age, we have a culture that's a lot healthier, right? That if somebody tells you something like that, you would immediately call them out and there's an avenue by which we could change those behaviors. And those behaviors, thankfully, have been changing. But they were very pervasive, when I was studying biology back home. But after I came to the US, it was unbelievable. The culture here was very supportive. I was a graduate student at Cornell and I took my first classes in English there. The first draft of the first paper I ever published, I wrote 50 drafts of it, because the first time you write a paper in English is not easy. It was really, really painful. And I had people who were willing to read it over and over again and help me change all those prepositions. This is pre-AI, you all, we didn't
no
have,
Grammarly or anything.
grammar correction at all. It was like, what's in, what's on. I always got it wrong. And so I had a lot of support. But then again, you always find people who are going to comment on whether what you're achieving is because of what you're doing or because of who you are, right? Of your identity. And, those people are never going to go away. And to me, they just provided, more stimulus for me to just prove everybody wrong and just be the best scientist that I could possibly be, right? But then an interesting thing happened. Once I started working on this sex stuff within academia is universal support, right? Because it's a cool story, it's a cool topic. People realize that we have neglected this area of research for a very long time. And so a lot of people, like you and like many other colleagues are like, oh, this research is so cool, it's so important, it's crazy that we've neglected it for so long. But then when you go out to the broader public, the story is a little bit different, right? Because there is a fascination with sex and sexual behavior, like when you look at what papers are picked up in the major newspapers or radio or whatever, oftentimes those papers have to do with sex and with weird sexual behavior in nature because people are really fascinated by it. But at the same time, there is again that sort of prudish streak of like a little resistance in like, well, why do we have to look at the private parts of animals? Like that doesn't seem to be really legit in some ways. Or where is the medical importance? And so I have encountered this kind of political attack with my research in the past. And as you mentioned earlier, I do a lot of advocacy for basic science because I learned the hard way, honestly, that this phrase that your work will speak for yourself, which is one that we're often told and the people take to heart, oh, your work will speak for yourself. And it's like, no, actually, your work doesn't speak for yourself. You have to speak up for your work.
Because other people are going to interpret it how they want.
Exactly. And so what is the message that you want to be out there? And then what can you do to, get your sound bites, the things that you think are important about your work out there. And so in my case, it was during the sequestration, which I was being reminded of during this very long government shutdown. Because in the sequestration, when Obama was president, the Congress couldn't agree on a budget. And so they decided they were going to cut everything by 10% until there was some kind of agreement. And everything was everything. So they cut all the programs by 10%. They didn't close the government. Everything kept running, but now you had to figure out how to cut 10% out of your budget. And in that political context, one of the things that happens is that they start pulling out science projects and grants that are being funded that the Republicans at the time seemed wasteful. And my grant, the grant that I had at the time, where I was studying actually this question that I spoke about earlier of this phenotypic plasticity in the genital morphology, that's the grant that I had at the time. And so this was pulled out as an example of wasteful government spending because, of course, it's penises and it's ducks, and you can make a lot of fun out of those two things when you put them together.
I remember it was that one and the shrimp running on treadmills was the other
Shrimp
one.
on the trail meat had been a little bit earlier, right?
Earlier.
And again,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah. So the point is that, these examples that these politicians picked on to tact are always organismal biology, right? So it's the shrimp in the treadmill. It was the chimpanzees throwing poop. It was birds in your backyard, snail sex. It's always organismal because people can understand those things, right? Like, what a duck is and you know what a penis is. There's a ton of basic science that goes on in other fields like math and chemistry and physics, but you can't make fun of it because people won't understand it. It just goes over their head, right? But it is the basis of progress, right? And it's the basis of applied products that are the things that we ultimately want. So it was interesting for me to sort of be faced with this reality of like, oh my gosh, here's my research being attacked. And I have to come up with a reasonable defense for why what I do is important. But I wasn't sure why it was important because it turns out that as a scientist, nobody teaches you this. Nobody ever taught me, oh, here's the distinction between basic and applied science. And this is how you feed into this classification because of the questions you ask. Did anybody ever tell you about that, Laura?
No.
No, you just figure it out, right? Like at some point you're like, oh, okay, well, I do this kind of science and those people are the applied scientists. And
and then you sort of think like, how is my work going to get funded? Do I need to make it applied? All those questions. Yes.
Exactly. Because but it's not something we really teach. And so how would people know the distinction and how do they relate to each other and why it's so critically important that we fund basic science, right? Which is why the current really attacks on the NSF are so scary because the NSF, the National Science Foundation, has traditionally been in this country the body that funds this basic research and this basic science. And of course, I love that Louis Pasteur had this really great analogy that he said, basic science is the tree and applied science is the fruit. Right?
I love that.
And so if you don't take care of the tree, if you don't feed the tree, if you don't grow the tree, you are not going to have any fruit.
Right.
And I think that that's exactly accurate. And that's what we will see as a consequence of these attacks down the line. But the fact that we have, in fact, been one of the original countries that invested the most in basic science is what has put the US at the top of scientific discovery for so many decades, right? It's because we did make that investment. So I had to learn how to talk about this, how to put it on a framework that people could identify and understand, because the fact that we might want to understand the world and explain how nature works and they were curious about it is not going to be enough to someone who's just paying their taxes. And they are really legitimately wondering, like, why should we pay for these things that sound so weird, especially when they're misrepresented in the press. But we need to be able to justify why. And we need scientists to take this as part of their job, of part of our job very seriously, and either teach about it at the undergraduate level, right? Because even if we teach, a lot of us teach intro bio classes. And the vast majority of our intro bio students are not going to go into science, but they might go and become doctors, or they might, become lawyers, or who knows what they'll end up doing. But if they learn about the basic way in which science works, then they can make better choices as educated voters sometimes down the line. And so we should be teaching about this. We should be writing op-eds about it. We should be giving money to institutions that do this kind of advocacy for science in Washington, like the AAAS and and the American Institute for Biological Sciences. We should be speaking to our Rotary Club, to our senior centers, to high schoolers, anybody. And that outreach, what it does is that it puts that message out there of the importance of having a broad view of science and how it ends up becoming an application that benefits everybody down the line.
Right. No, that's great. And you've been such a good role model for doing all those things. So thank you.
Well, it was forced upon me.
It was forced, but no, I don't think so though. I guess I didn't see it that way. You could have written directly to the people who are complaining, but you really put yourself out there publicly and shared it with all of us in the community of how you speak about the importance of the science.
No, I think that is true. And that was perhaps the main difference, is that I was told, oh, this happens all the time. Don't worry about it. People will forget about it tomorrow.
Sure.
Like, don't bother, right?
Yeah.
But I didn't think that was a good message. I didn't think that was a good way to proceed, because it's almost like a neglect of duty. If people are talking about your research, like, you have to jump in there and defend your science.
Yeah, that's just possible. Yeah. As we wrap up, this has just been such a fascinating conversation and such an important conversation. I was wondering if there's anything I didn't ask about that you'd like to share with our audience.
Yeah, I think that one of the goals of my research, honestly, has become to normalize the use of this language around female reproductive parts. The vagina, the clitoris, orgasm, pleasure, all of these things that we just do not ever talk about as much as we should, honestly. I learned that there are a lot of women who, for example, have this condition called vaginal prolapse. And this is a condition that can affect women who are older, and also women who have given birth to a lot of babies vaginally. And it results in a buckling of your vaginal wall that can lead to incontinence and painful sex, and even complete inability to have sex. And women often will not talk to their doctors about this because they are embarrassed. They are embarrassed to go in and say, my vagina is collapsing. And I find that just absolutely unjustifiable. This is, 2025. We need to realize that these are just body parts that are important. They're medically important. They're biologically important. They should be things that we talk about without taboo, without giggles, without any. They're just important biological parts that have to function properly. And we should be able to have those conversations. And so if there is anything in my research that can allow people to have those conversations about weird duck vaginas and weird shark vaginas and dolphin clitorises and whatever.
Normalize talking about vaginas.
Normalize it because it is normal.
Yeah,
right?
It's totally normal. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I feel like I could talk to you for hours more, but thank you so much for joining us. I really, really appreciate it, and all of your insights and just the amazing role model that you are for all of us. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for doing this podcast, because this is precisely the kind of outreach that we all need to be doing. So thank you for this cool initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all for listening. Thanks also to our production team, Isabel Espinoza, Lane Patton, and Daphne Trilliana. The music used in this episode is from I Don't Smoke by the Mythical Score Society.